Welcome back. Today we'll be talking about sad moments where families were mauled by deadly animals. From sleeping in a tent that got a family fatally attacked to an elephant that trampled over the Collins family. But first, we jump into a family that is mauled by a saltwater crocodile. May 25th, 2026. The northern Australian coast sat under the heavy heat that follows the wet season. Tidal zones running full, the banks of every drainage carrying more water than they showed. Daniel Brooks, 45, had found a remote beach well off the tourist map. A construction company owner who researched his own trips and avoided itineraries built by anyone else. Melissa, 43, a high school biology teacher, stayed at the camper preparing lunch, while Emily, 17, and Noah, 15, walked to the water. Warning signs stood at the vegetation edge, faded and partly hidden by new wet season growth. The family passed them without stopping. What the kids walked into wasn't a beach. It was the mouth of a tidal creek, freshwater drainage meeting tidal saltwater. Visibility dropping to inches. The precise terrain where saltwater crocodiles spend their most active hours. From their approach angle, it looked like an extension of the beach. That misread was the event everything else followed from. Saltwater crocodiles are the largest living reptile, regularly 13 to 17 feet and up to 1,100 pounds ambush predators built for exactly this terrain, lying motionless in murky shallows until they strike in a fraction of a second. A saltwater crocodile at a tidal creek mouth in afternoon heat right after the wet season isn't somewhere unusual. It's the single most predictable place it could be. If I'm honest, the moment I read Tidal Creek mouth, Northern Australia, I already know how this ended. Emily waded to knee depth when the crocodile erupted from the shallows. The initial bite locked across her lower thigh, somewhere above 3,500 psi, distributed through soft tissue and bone simultaneously. She went under before she registered what had hold of her. Noah grabbed her arms and pulled. The crocodile death rolled a full axial rotation that uses the animal's mass and the water's resistance to prevent any planted resistance from above, and Emily went fully under. Noah was pulled in with the rotation. The creek dropped sharply within feet of the bank, knee-deep at the edge, well over their heads at the roll's position. Zero visibility from an inch below the surface. As the crocodile resecured its hold on Emily, the repositioning bite caught Noah high on the trapezius near the cervical spine. Daniel heard them and ran in. The crocodile seized his forearm, fracturing the radius, stripping the musculature in a single compression. He went under. One animal, three people, zero visibility. Melissa reached the bank to find the surface already still. The turbulence from the encounter had settled in under a minute. She waded in to her chest. The creek bottom dropped sharply, 3 feet from the bank, into water, well over her head, and found nothing to grip. She came back out. She was the only member of the family who did. A patrol found the abandoned camper late that afternoon. The creek gave back the 3 bodies over the following 36 hours. Saltwater crocodiles typically cache prey near the ambush site, and that behavior led investigators to the positions. Emily drowned during the hold, her lungs filled before the crocodile had finished its work. Noah's cervical wound and the submersion together decided his outcome before Daniel reached the water. Daniel's cause of death was also drowning. All 3 were found within 20 feet of where Emily had first waded in. Investigators noted the family had unknowingly chosen one of the highest risk configurations possible in croc habitat, an active creek mouth, peak heat post-wet season. Everything had signaled the same thing before they arrived. The warning signs had been legible. Melissa gave a statement from the hospital where she was treated for shock. She had not gone past the point where the creek bottom dropped. What happened in Northern Australia involved the geography the family had no experience reading. What comes next happened in a terrain the family knew well, or believed they did. That brief is precisely what cost them. October 11th, 2019. The Arctic coastline of northern Canada was settling into the stillness before freeze-up sea ice, not yet consolidated, polar bears concentrated on land in a deepening caloric deficit. They aren't inactive in this window. They're searching, patient, and a campsite with cooking smell in the air isn't background noise. It's a signal worth investigating. The Hansen family had camped across northern Canada many times. Eric, 42, an electrical engineer who ran logistics with professional precision. Laura, 40, an emergency room nurse who reads situations fast under pressure. Mason, 14, who had been camping since he could carry a pack. By most wilderness standards, they were capable. The Arctic coastline in October isn't most wilderness, and the skills that matter there aren't the ones built on boreal forest trails. That distinction never made it into the planning. They chose an isolated stretch of coast because no one else was camping there, a preference that had served them well everywhere else. Here, it placed them on a documented active polar bear transit corridor during the pre-freeze period. No signage marked the access point. They set up camp, cleaned up efficiently, and stored most food correctly. But cooking smell doesn't store with the food it disperses into clothing, cookware, the tent, the ground. In cold, calm Arctic air, scent carries well over a mile under good conditions. A hungry bear following that gradient overnight is doing exactly what hungry bears in that environment do in that season. Polar bears are the only bear classified as a marine mammal. Their biology built entirely around sea ice and the seals hunted from it. Without that ice, a bear in a deepening caloric deficit follows food scent to its source. That's not aggression in the conventional sense. It's motivation, and a campsite with cooking residue is exactly what that motivation responds to. I've seen people treat polar bear country the same as camping anywhere else in the north. Same gear, same mental framework. It isn't the same environment, and that mismatch costs people every few years in exactly this way. Strong evening winds masked the sound of an animal crossing frozen ground. By the time the wind dropped and the night went still, the bear was already closed. The first sign the family had was the tent wall tearing open with no preceding sound that registered as warning. A polar bear doesn't probe a tent, it hits it. Single layer, nylon rated for wind load, offered no resistance to an animal applying its full weight, claws, and jaws in the same motion. The opening it made was large enough to enter without ducking. Sleeping bags, packed gear, and collapsed tent poles filled the entry side immediately. There was no room to stand. The interior was now occupied by 800 pounds of animal, with 3 people who couldn't move in any direction without moving toward it. Eric used what worked against black bears in the forest flashlight. Raised voice, but a polar bear already inside a tent, having tracked food scent for miles, has no ambiguity about what's in front of it. Eric sustained the first serious contact, a bite to the upper neck and skull that the voice and light hadn't deterred and couldn't have. He went down in the collapsed interior and did not get back up. Laura put herself between the bear and Mason. A food-motivated polar bear in a confined space doesn't investigate and withdraw. It remains until nothing offers resistance. Laura received a bite contact to the shoulder and neck as the bear moved toward the back of the tent. She died in the position she'd chosen. Mason survived the initial attack with serious injuries, the bear having moved through without directing the same sustained attention at him. The temperature that night dropped to minus 12 degrees Celsius and continued falling. He had no way to call for help. Field researchers down the coast raised the alarm at the missed morning check-in. The response team reached the campsite 9 hours later. Mason had died from his injuries and from exposure before they arrived. All 3 members of the Hansen family were dead when the researchers got there. The camp was in the condition a food-motivated polar bear leaves behind after an extended engagement. Investigators confirmed the coastline was an active transit corridor in a year when sea ice formed significantly late, concentrating more bears on the land margin longer than typical. That information was accessible to anyone who called ahead before October 11th. It simply wasn't part of the plan. In the Arctic, the danger was written into the season, documented, predictable, invisible to family with no reason to know it. The Nax family knew the landscape. They worked for years The risk they missed wasn't hidden in geography. It was moving through the grass at the edge of their own field. July 18th, 2016. The late afternoon light along the farming border of a wildlife reserve in southern Africa had softened into the long amber stretch before sunset, the exact window large predators shift from resting to active. The grass at the edge of Grace Moile's maize fields was tall and dry, a light wind moving across it from the reserve side. Grace, 38, had farmed this land most of her adult life and was finishing a harvest late because rain was coming. Peter, 15, and Ruth, 13, were helping gather equipment as the light faded. Nothing about the evening looked different from any other. The fields bordered unfenced bushland, connecting directly to the reserve. Livestock occasionally disappeared from the margins. Attacks on people were rare enough that nobody structured their day around them. Grace wasn't doing anything unusual. African lions hunt primarily at dusk and dawn. Adult females weigh 260 to 400 pounds and can reach 50 miles per hour over short distances. Their final approach through dry grass nearly silent, terminal acceleration, over the last 30 to 50 feet, leaving prey under a second to react. Lions rarely target adult humans in open terrain, but documented attacks cluster around a specific combination: low light, broken sightlines, separation from the group, proximity to a reserve boundary, dry season prey movement, pushing predators wider. On July 18th, every condition was present at once. Peter walked toward the grass line to retrieve equipment left there earlier. The distance between him and Grace when the lioness launched meant the first strike had already happened before Grace could move. The first contact knocked Peter face down into the dry grass. The hold that followed was to the back of his neck and cervical spine sustained, the kind a lion establishes after the knockdown to prevent any recovery of position. Peter didn't move after it was established. Grace ran toward it, exactly what a parent does, and struck the lioness across the skull with the tool she was carrying. The animal released Peter and turned toward Grace. The disengagement didn't change what had already happened to Peter. It changed what happened to Grace. A second lion entered from the east edge of the field, already moving through the tall grass before the attack had started, drawn by the same late afternoon corridor the first had used. Ruth had no direction left. The grass line was to her left. Grace and the first lioness were to her right. The second lion was already crossing the only open gap. The encounter moved across roughly 40 feet of open ground in under 3 minutes. Both lions retreated into the bush before the neighbors who heard the screaming reached the field. They found Peter first at the grass line where he'd walked toward the equipment. Grace was 25 feet from him in the direction she'd run. Ruth was at the east margin of the field. All three were dead before the neighbors arrived. The lions had retreated not because of the approaching voices, but because the field had gone quiet. Authorities determined the attack occurred during the day's highest risk window, in terrain offering maximum concealment. It was the same land Grace had worked for years. It wasn't the same conditions she'd built her understanding of it in. In southern Africa, danger came from familiar land, read through an understanding of risk the season had quietly made obsolete.
What follows is a story where the risk was explicitly marked on boards at a fence line, and one interpretive decision about those signs meant put a family without any way to call for help 7 hours from the care that might have saved them.
January 9th, 2021. The Australian interior had run above 104 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 weeks straight, the ground holding heat into evening, the air dry enough to pull moisture from skin within minutes. Owen Carter, 39, was a freelance writer who championed stripping modern convenience from outdoor travel. The satellite communicator they didn't carry was a deliberate choice, not an oversight. Rachel, 37, was a nature photographer. Ethan, 12, was homeschooled with field time as his classroom. 3 weeks into a remote bushland traverse, the nearest town with definitive medical care was more than 7 hours away by road. I understand the appeal of stripping back gear on a long walk, but a satellite communicator isn't a luxury. It's the line between a bad situation and an unrecoverable one. And in remote Australia in January, that line is thinner than most people expect. Owen took a shortcut through an abandoned farming property, saving about 2 miles. Snake warning signs stood at the fence line, sun-bleached but legible, installed after documented prior incidents. The family noted them and kept going, Owen reading them as general bushland caution rather than a specific elevated hazard at that exact site. In most places, that read holds up. Sustained heat and a spike in the local rodent population, concentrated around collapsed grain stores and debris, had drawn a high density of coastal taipans into the grass and rubble. None of that density was visible from the fence line. The signs were the only warning the property offered. Coastal taipans are among the most medically dangerous snakes on Earth, the venom that works two ways simultaneously: a procoagulant complex that collapses the blood's clotting system, and a neurotoxin that progressively shuts down the muscles controlling breathing. Without antivenom within a clinically meaningful window, both processes together produce organ failure and respiratory collapse within hours. About 10 minutes into the tall grass, beside the first collapsed structure, Ethan stepped beside a hidden taipan. Strike, instant release. The initial sensation barely registers. A sharp pressure, and then the snake is gone. The envenomation begins systemically, quietly. Rachel, a few feet behind, shifted her footing away from where he'd stepped directly into matted debris, where a second taipan was resting in the stored ground heat. It bit her calf and released. 8 minutes after the first bite, Owen applied pressure immobilization, bandaging to both, fast and correctly. Standing afterward, he stepped back into scrub he hadn't checked. A third taipan was beneath it, his ankle. 3 bites in 15 minutes. They started walking, staying put, with no communication device, served no purpose, even though walking speeds venom transport.
Owen knew both things. He chose the only option that gave them any chance at all.
Ethan deteriorated fastest, smallest body mass, highest venom concentration per kilogram. By the 3rd mile, he couldn't walk. Owen carried him. Rachel's pressure bandage was bleeding through. Owen's headache arrived like pressure from inside his skull. No shade, no water remaining. No one came the other way. The ranger who noted the Carter family's truck still at the trailhead the following morning called it in. The family was found spread across roughly 600 meters of trail Ethan at a collapsed wall where Owen had set him down. Rachel, 200 meters beyond that in open ground. Owen, another 400 meters further, still moving in the direction of the trailhead when he went down. The medical examiner confirmed all 3 deaths were consistent with untreated coastal taipan envenomation, combined coagulopathy, and progressive respiratory failure. Time of death estimated between 4 and 6 hours after Ethan's first bite. Investigators confirmed the warning signs had accurately described that specific site for years. They hadn't been wrong. The decision that organized everything that followed was the family's read of what those signs meant. Australia's interior hides risk in stillness and ground cover, encountered one step at a time in a place that had been labeled. What follows happened somewhere the family had visited many times with an animal they believed they understood. August 3rd, 2017. The riverside outside the Bunda family's town moved slowly in late afternoon light. Banks lined with reeds, the air carrying the flat smell of a slow river in dry season, a regular weekend destination for as long as anyone in the family could remember. Joseph, 44, maintained tour buses. Lydia, 41, taught elementary school. Samuel, 16, brought his phone to photograph shorebirds. They'd picnic on this exact stretch of bank many times before. Joseph had grown up near rivers and lived alongside hippos his whole life. He didn't rank them with crocodiles or venomous snakes, animals whose danger he actively managed. Hippos registered as large, but not as something requiring ongoing adjustment of where he stood. That belief is common among people who've lived near hippos without a serious incident. It's also mechanically consistently wrong. Hippos are among the most dangerous large animals in Africa. Males weigh 3,000 to almost 10,000 pounds and can reach 19 miles per hour on land. Their aggression is territorial and defensive, organized around a single trigger, anything blocking their path back to water. They graze at night and return by a fixed route. When something is in that route, they don't detour or signal long enough for anyone to react. They charge through.
I'll be straightforward. There's almost no meaningful response available to someone standing in a charging hippo directs path at close range.
Samuel had walked toward the shoreline for a better photo angle. Without anyone realizing it, the family had positioned themselves across the route. A hippo grazing farther inland than usual that day needed to take back to the river. The first clear view any of them had of the animal was a hippo already at full speed, not building to a charge, completing one. At 19 miles per hour, the time between first visibility at 30 feet and contact is under a second. Joseph ran toward Samuel and directly into the path the hippo was already moving through. The initial impact, an animal of that mass at that speed threw him several meters off his feet. He did not get up. Samuel was caught in the same pass. A lateral blow from the animal's shoulder and flank that delivered the full weight of the animal's momentum into his side. The internal injuries weren't visible from the outside and couldn't have been managed at the riverside. On the second pass, the hippo returning to confirm its corridor was clear. Lydia was still in the animal's path. The jaw closed on her torso before the animal continued toward the water. The hippo entered the river after the corridor cleared and didn't return. Emergency services were called immediately by other visitors on the bank. Joseph had died from the initial impact before anyone reached him. Samuel died from internal hemorrhagic trauma before evacuation was possible. Lydia died from the crush injury before the scene was stabilized. All three were dead when definitive care arrived. The investigation concluded the family had unknowingly occupied the corridor between the hippo's grazing ground and the river during its return window, the exact configuration that produces hippo charges across the continent repeatedly for decades. It wasn't unusual behavior. It's what hippos do when that corridor is blocked. The bandas had picnicked there many times before. They'd simply never stood in that exact spot at that exact hour. The banda family had no warning before the hippo moved. The next family had warnings on the riverbank itself, fresh, unambiguous, left by the animals that had fed there hours earlier.
They read them and kept going downstream anyway.
September 14, 2018. The remote Alaskan river the Reed family had driven most of the day to reach was running cold and clear. The salmon run at its peak, the water carrying the dense organic smell of spawning fish crowding the shallows. Michael, 46, an accountant who spent 1 month a year chasing exactly this kind of isolated water. Karen, 44, trusted the logistics he'd built over years of trips. Tyler, 16, shared his father's enthusiasm and his habit of drifting ahead when something on the bank looked worth investigating. Michael had fished remote Alaska during salmon season for years, building a working framework that had held up right up until the day it didn't. Experience without interruption starts to feel like expertise, even when it isn't the same thing. The riverbank downstream told the same story it tells every year on Alaskan rivers during the run. Partial salmon carcasses along the gravel, some recent, some scattered remains from feeding hours earlier. Fresh carcasses during the run aren't incidental scenery. They're a direct signal of what's been using that section of river, how recently and in what context. Michael noted them. The family kept going downstream. Brown bears during the run eat up to 20,000 calories a day before hibernation. A sow runs 2 non-negotiable priorities: maximize intake at feeding sites and eliminate any perceived threat to cubs without hesitation. At a feeding site with cubs present, the gap between a sudden close approach and a charge is effectively zero, no assessment of intent, just proximity and response.
What I keep thinking about is the salmon run bear encounters. The carcasses on the bank aren't background scenery.
Tyler moved ahead around a bend where thick brush cut sight lines to under 30 feet. He came around it and closed within that distance of a sow and her nearly grown cub feeding at the water's edge before either side registered the other. The sow launched before Tyler processed what he was looking at. She covered 25 feet in under 2 seconds. The first strike, a forepaw swipe, took him off his feet and put him face down on the gravel. The sow bit into the back of his neck and upper skull. A single hold, the kind of contact a bear makes to neutralize something. It reads as an immediate threat to its cubs. Then Michael's voice reached the bend from upstream. The sow released and turned toward the new sound before Tyler had stopped moving. She hadn't stayed to finish. The wound had finished it. Tyler lost consciousness on the gravel. He was dead before Michael reached him. Michael made noise and threw gear toward the sound to pull the sow's attention his way. It worked in the narrow sense that it converted him into the next target. The bite closed on his forearm and held. The ulna and radius fractured under the compression. He went down. The sow redirected to his upper arm and shoulder a lateral shake that opened both wounds, then moved off when he stopped moving. The brachial artery involvement meant the outcome had a timeline measured in minutes. He had no tourniquet. He was on a remote gravel bank more than 2 hours from a helicopter. He was conscious for some portion of the time before he stopped being conscious. Karen took a forepaw swipe as the sow pivoted toward her. She went down, stayed face down, held position. The sow disengaged and returned to her cub at the water's edge. Karen got up to find Tyler dead and Michael dying on the bank. She had no phone signal and no personal beacon. Anglers upstream had heard the commotion and recognized it. One of them had a satellite communicator. They called wildlife authorities and reached the bank on foot in roughly 20 minutes. Michael had died from blood loss before they arrived. Karen was the only person on the bank when they got there. Investigators noted the evidence had communicated the risk as directly as wilderness signals ever do. The carcasses, the timing in the run,
All of it present and visible beforehand. None of it changed the decision to keep fishing downstream.
In Alaska, the warning was written on the bank itself in the most literal terms wilderness produces, and it was walked past. The final story takes place somewhere managed a marked trail, a professional guide, a family that followed every instruction right up to the moment one of them didn't. November 22nd, 2015. The forest inside a national park in central India filtered midday light through a canopy still partly in leaf, undergrowth thick enough to cut sightlines to 20 or 30 feet. The ground covered in roots and dry leaf fall that made quiet movement nearly impossible. The Collins family had booked a forest walk through a small local tour operator with a guide who'd worked the same trails for over a decade. Richard, 48, a financial advisor. Susan, 46, an architect. Jake, 18, home from his first college semester. Richard photographed wildlife seriously. Years of field time across multiple continents, a method refined through repeated success. That long record had gradually made official protocol feel optional whenever his own read of a situation said things were fine. He wasn't reckless. His experience had simply made caution feel unnecessary, where it still was. The guide gave the same briefing before every walk. Stay on the trail. Stay together. Stay behind him. Never enter the vegetation. Not bureaucratic caution. A rule built from years in a forest where the distance between safe observation and dangerous proximity can be under 20 feet, and where stepping off the trail means stepping towards something you can't see until you're already inside it. Richard acknowledged the instructions. Asian elephants live in matriarchal herds led by an experienced older female. With young calves present, the matriarch and surrounding females operate at heightened protective sensitivity. Any unfamiliar movement near the herd's perimeter triggers a response with no assessment of intent, just proximity and signal. In dense forest, the gap between outside the perimeter and inside it can be a few steps through vegetation.
I keep coming back to this. In that forest, you can't see a herd from 20 feet away. You can see one elephant in a gap. One calm elephant in a gap looks nothing like a herd with calves 30 feet to the side. The gap between that instruction and the outcome it was designed to prevent was 20 feet of vegetation and whatever was on the other side of it. From the trail, those two positions looked identical.
Richard spotted a single female about 60 feet off the trail near a partial clearing. She looked calm. He stepped off for a better photo angle. Susan and Jake followed the move as natural as ones he'd made in plenty of other places before. What the vegetation concealed completely was that the rest of the herd, calves included, stood less than 40 feet to her left. The family had stepped inside the herd's protective perimeter without knowing it existed. The matriarch charged from the concealed group's direction, appearing from an angle the family hadn't expected because the animals she was protecting had been invisible until she moved. The guide on the trail, with a different sightline, recognized it first and called for retreat. The family turned on root-crossed uneven ground. The half-second advantage the guide had didn't change where Richard was standing when the matriarch arrived. The head and tusk strike at full speed was not survivable. Richard was thrown clear and did not get up. Susan moved toward him, what a spouse does, and moved into the continuation of the charge through the same corridor. The secondary contact of an 8,000-pound animal in full motion drove her into the root-covered ground. She did not get up. Jake, farthest back and still moving toward the trail, was caught at the tree line by a flanking female. The impact against the tree trunk he was driven into completed the injury. The guide reached the trail and radioed park rangers. The herd moved back into the vegetation before they arrived. All three members of the Collins family were dead at the site. The guide was uninjured. He had pre-identified his exit before the matriarch moved. That's what a decade of walking that exact forest produces. Not faster reflexes, but a route chosen before the need for it arrives. The family had followed his instructions right up until the moment Richard stepped off the trail.
The gap between that instruction and the outcome it was designed to prevent was 20 feet of vegetation and whatever was on the other side of it. From the trail, those two positions looked identical. They weren't even close to the same thing.